what would you say overall are your favorite areas in philosophy, if you do have any favorites?
I think I think I do, right? I think um, I can probably get interested in pretty much any philosophical topic, right?
Mhm.
I can maybe name as a challenge two or three that I've always found boring and still can't find a way to be interested in them, but maybe I'll
Really?
set those aside. Um,
Okay.
yeah, because it's probably my fault, right? I always think it's my fault if I don't find it interesting. Uh, but I think the sort of two questions that I think are really interesting philosophically, and I'm lucky that they're the ones that I get to teach about, are what makes a society just or unjust? Um, and I'm especially interested in answers to that question that are very practical. So they're not so abstract that you can't see how it applies to our everyday lives. Um, and I'm also especially interested in versions of that question that don't just have to do with government, but have to do with society as well. Um, because there are some strands of political philosophy that think that justice is just a matter of how the government is set up. But there are other people, so feminist philosophers argue that the personal is political. Right?
Mhm.
What they mean by that is that you can have a perfectly just government, but if the society isn't just, then or if the culture isn't just, then the society as a whole isn't just. Right? I think there are versions of that in lots of different philosophies. I mean, I think Alexis de Tocqueville says something like this in Democracy in America. I think that John Dewey certainly thinks this in his social theory. Um, so versions of this crop up in different ways, but I find it really exciting, right? To think that it's not just about government. I often find when students come to DFRL that they're pleasantly surprised to find, oh, we're not just talking about government. We're talking about like how we relate to our neighbor, right? And I find that
Right.
really exciting. So that's one question. Is like, what makes a society just or unjust? And the other one is, what kind of life should I live? Right? Um, and the way that people usually refer to that question is, what is the meaning of life? But I think that's actually a poorly formed question. I think sometimes people get tripped up on it because they're partially tripped up by the way it's phrased,
Yeah.
right? So like, are you asking for the definition of a word? Or there's some ways that it's phrased where it can only be answered by like in a religious context where there's some outside authority figure who's saying, "Here's why I created this." Right?
Mhm.
Um, but if you rephrase it as, "What kind of life should I live?" which I think is what people are getting at when they ask, "What is the meaning of life?" then I think it's a clearer question and one that has more traction for us to think about. And Another way you can think about it is like, are some lifestyles more choice worthy than others? Right. Um, so, for example, uh, should I live a life of adventure or a life of caution? Um, should I step outside my comfort zone, right, and try to grow into a new type of person, or should I like listen to my inner child and try to be authentically who I've always been? Right? Um, what's another version of this question? Should I have like a diversity of interests, or should I really go narrow in the specific interest in my life? Right? And as a sidebar, I think these are questions that, um, especially CRA students, as they're getting ready to go to college, are starting to realize, oh, I have to make practical decisions that
Yeah.
weigh on all these questions. Right? Another one is like, should I live a life, uh, the life of the hustle, right? Hard work, or should I try to live more in the moment and live more tranquilly? Right? Another one is, should I worry about things that are outside of my control? Right? Um, I think this, by the way, is different than this question of what kind of life should I live, is different than the question of moral philosophy, because in the at least since the Enlightenment, right? And I'm doing surgery with a hand grenade here. There are a lot of exceptions, but at least since the Enlightenment, there's been a tendency to think that moral philosophy and ethics is about how I should treat other people. Right? But what kind of life should I live is asking a question with a slightly different flavor. right? Where it's saying, independent of like, am I doing somebody wrong, right? Uh, because it doesn't necessarily involve other people, right? What kind of life should I live is more asking about yourself, right? Now,
Right.
that's too much of a generalization, but I'm trying to sort of signal it's a slightly different question than the question of ethics.
It's kind of like what Kant says, like you have somewhat of a duty to yourself too. You have to think about, like the moral
Mhm.
ideas of what does it mean, what life would I live to be more to myself, kind of.
Yeah, and like as an aside, in our class, if I can do some inside baseball, right? I was pleasantly surprised when I did that poll asking, "Do you agree with Kant that there are duties to yourself?" Because in the past, students would all say no. Like, if I'm not hurting other people, then I can do whatever I want with my own life. But our class really resonated with Kant's idea that you can have duties to yourself, and that you can be disrespecting yourself or not taking your own nature as a rational agent seriously if, for example, you
Mhm.
slack off all the time or um, something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you feel like, or like at least personally in your experience, has any kind of like conclusions you came about thinking about these sorts of philosophy actually went into your own life? Did you come to a conclusion about some sort of philosophy you want to live by, and then have that actually go into your life?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, right? And I wonder, like, how capable anybody is of answering that, because uh, a lot of the influence might be subconscious, right?
Yeah.
Um, or like, you only live your life sort of once through, and you don't know like how much something that happened like changed a decision you would make, sort of thing. Uh, but I guess I have a couple of answers to that. I don't know if these are the most important ones, but they're at least the ones that came to mind. Um, which is, um, there was a time in my life where I thought that um, the only things that were worth doing were things that were productive,
Hmm.
and they had to be productive in a way that either like uh, advanced your career or helped other people. Right? And otherwise, I thought you were like wasting time.
Hmm.
Um, but there's a book by a philosopher at MIT, Kieran Setia, on the midlife crisis, actually. We'll read part of it in CRA next semester.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
that argues that if you think that your main sources of value in life are achieving personal goals and helping other people, then logically that is an incomplete picture of what makes life meaningful. Um, and I'm tempted to go into the argument right now, but I think we'd go too much in the weeds. But I'll just sort of signal, right,
Mhm.
that it's sort of given me more of a sense that uh, doing things for their own sake rather than for the sake of their productivity has more value um, than I used to realize. Right? Another thing is, like, I think philosophy has really helped negatively in that it's helped me see that some things that our culture tempts you to think are important might not be that important. Right? So here I go all the way back to Aristotle. Right? Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics is talking about what makes um, or what a human should do with their life. Right? And uh, he Aristotle thinks right that you should only or your main pursuit in life is or your function in life is defined by what you uniquely can do, right? And there he means you, like what humans uniquely can do, right? And we can debate about whether or not that's true, right? Some students have pushback about against that, like, what if I uniquely can play the flute, but I hate it, right? Something like that. But I think there's a version of Aristotle's argument that we can um, see as plausible, and one use he puts it to is to say that um, three lives, right, that he considers are not fit for the human. Right? He says the life dedicated to pleasure is not fit for the human. The life dedicated toward wealth is not fit for the human, and the life dedicated to social prestige is not fit for the human. And I find myself thinking about those a lot because there's a lot of like cultural and even practical pressure to just take those things very seriously. And it
Mm-hmm.
never goes away. Like when we're sitting here talking about philosophy, of course we'll be like, oh yeah, those are, silly things. But when you're sitting down to pay the bills or when you're trying to like get ahead at work or like um, uh, when you're trying to like plan a vacation, the life dedicated to pleasure, the life dedicated to wealth, the life dedicated toward social esteem really have a lot of pressure on you. And I think that like
Mm-hmm.
if I could think of one like philosophical lesson that seeps into my everyday life is like thinking about how philosophers like Aristotle suggest that those aren't as important as we might think they are. And I found that really helpful.
Yeah, and especially things like wealth, prestige are definitely things you can find kind of like as you're doing practical things, and especially like life of pleasure, right? Because nowadays it feels like so many people are telling you, purpose of life is to be happy, is to find happiness, not success. But it's interesting to think that maybe like pleasure also is the sole goal that we should be going towards.
Yeah, and I think you putting it that way really helps point out that like Aristotle is making a point that would be pretty subversive today. Because a
Hmm.
lot of people today say the purpose of life is to be happy, right?
Yeah.
Defined as experiencing pleasure. But Aristotle would say that's a life not fit for the human, it's a life fit for animals. Because animals are their highest possible achievement is experiencing pleasure and pain, but we're capable of something more enriching and meaningful than that. So I think him saying that would actually be pretty provocative in today's culture where people say things like, I just want to be happy, right? Or the meaning of life is to be happy. Right? He thinks there's something misguided about that.
Yeah, I think definitely should be a balance, like a balance of doing things sometimes just for the sake of happiness, just for the sake of enjoyment, but then also a balance between doing things that are meaningful to you, that you feel like do have like a deeper enrichment to them.
Totally, and I think one thing that's helpful. I mean, now we're just sort of nerding out about Aristotle, but I don't mind at all. Is that Aristotle thinks that the life dedicated to pleasure is misguided, but he does think that fulfilling your function is going to make you happier than a life dedicated to pleasure. Right? It's actually the
Mhm.
opposite. He thinks pleasure will come as a side effect of doing uniquely human things. Um, and so somebody who fulfills their function will be happy. They'll experience pleasure. Um, but um, and here this might not be in Aristotle, but certainly in contemporary psychology. Right? Um, uh, a life dedicated to pleasure, right? If you intentionally set it as your goal and not as a side effect of what you do, right?
Mhm.
Often makes people unhappy, right? Because they're on this hedonic treadmill where they're trying
Right.
to sort of chase the next high, right? And we know from modern psychology that trying to chase the high of pleasure, our brains aren't wired to do that. Right? They
Mhm.
just kind of get used to whatever you're doing, and then you need, I don't know, a bigger ice cream or a bigger cup of coffee, right, to become more
Right.
stimulated. So, Aristotle isn't arguing uh, foregoing pleasure and living this austere life, right? In fact, he thinks that there, more than other ethical theories, I think, he thinks that there is a natural harmony between doing the right thing and feeling good, right?
Mhm.
Whereas other theories, right, that emerged later thought that like in order to do the right thing, you have to resist what's going to make you feel good. He's like, no, man,
Right.
it's all going to come out in the wash, and like and I think that's like he thinks like if you do things that are uniquely human, you'll probably end up having more of the modern sense of pleasure and happiness than otherwise. So it's pretty cool.
Mhm. Yeah, that's cool. So I guess like speaking of the fun, the pleasure that kind of comes from these sort of little side quests, as side effects, what are some of the things you do for fun outside of OHS and outside of philosophy then?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there was a time like when I was a student where all I did was philosophy, and I think I had
Mhm.
actually had came across philosophical reasons to not feel that way, do that anymore. Uh, One is and I like how you asked a non-philosophical question. Now I'm just answering with philosophy. But uh, uh, my dissertation director wrote an interesting short article
Mhm.
comparing philosophy to stand-up comedy. And the
Oh.
idea is stand-up comics sometimes when they get famous, run out of good material because all they're doing is traveling around and touring, and so they're not living a real life anymore.
Hmm.
And my dissertation director said something similar about philosophy. Right? In order to do good philosophy, you have to go out into the world and live a real life. Right? So just sitting
Right.
in your study all the time, it's just going to be a snake that eats its own tail, and there's not going to be any friction or attraction or new material to work with. So I think to
Mm.
actually do philosophy well, you actually have to like go out in the world and live. Um, and another one is Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America makes an observation that took me a while to sort of understand what he was saying, but he says that in democracy, there is a tendency for people to withdraw and become very individualistic. And he doesn't
Hmm.
mean selfish, he means lonely. Right? So he thinks everybody kind of withdraws into their own house or apartment or whatever. They don't really engage anymore. And he thinks that makes them more vulnerable to manipulation and
Mm.
to tyranny. Uh, and he thinks the antidote to that is civic organizations. Right? So that means things like your PTA, it means like your book club, it means your knitting club, it means
Mm.
your, your ballet, your local theater, right? And that's actually worrying because there was this famous book, Bowling Alone, that came out, I think, in the late 90s, that argues that Americans have just stopped joining, right? And they become more isolated, and Tocqueville says that's dangerous. So, long-winded answer to your question. Um, I'm pretty involved in a running organization, but it's more than just running. It's a social organization. People go on trips together and they go camping together and they have dinners together and stuff like that.
Oh, cool.
And that's been a big part of my life. So I do that um, 3 or 4 days a week. I'm also part of a book club that met last night. We read a book about um, teenage girls that are boxers. So
Mhm.
they fight, and each chapter was a one of the fights or bouts, whatever they're called.
Uh-huh.
And as they were fighting, they would zoom in, and you get to know the backstories and lives of the individual fighters. It was really interesting. Um, and I think those are probably the two main things I do outside. Well, another thing I'll mention is I set a project this year
Mhm.
to try to make um, 52 new recipes in 52 weeks to kind of push myself
Ooh.
outside my comfort zone. The hardest thing I made was croissants. That took me like 3 days and a lot of stress and a lot of tape measuring and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it was a lot of fun. And I also, everybody during COVID started making sourdough bread. I started making sourdough bread, I think, a year
Mhm.
after COVID, but now we do it about every other week, something like that.
That's cool. How much? What's your progress on it right now? How many weeks out of the 52 are you
Oh,
on?
I'm behind. It started out as a recipe per week in 2024. And
Mhm.
then when grading got difficult, it became 52 recipes in 2024. They don't have to be one per week. I think I'm like 5 or 6 weeks behind, but if I do two per week for the rest of the year, I think I'll catch up.
Wow, that's close. That's close. What's
Mhm.
your favorite thing that you made so far?
Favorite thing I've made so far? I'd say the croissants. That was really cool. I was pretty impressed that I thought that that was something that only like a professional could do. But I think you just need a lot of time and patience to make that work.
That's cool. That's cool. All right, so we've been on a long rant today, going through all of philosophy, going through all of these fun things you do. So, to end off then with one last question, would you say there's any advice you would give to any of our listeners thinking of going to maybe like philosophy for their major or career, or, just any advice in general to our OHSers?
Yeah, I'd say like the advice I'd give is that uh, I had a teacher once who said there's no shallow end to the philosophy pool. And I
Mm-hmm.
think about that a lot. There's no shallow end of the philosophy pool. So you compare it to like something like algebra. Algebra, you start at the bottom, you master everything. You go, I got this, then you move up, and then you learn the next thing, you master it. In philosophy, we just take you, we throw you into the pool, and say, learn to swim, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that can be scary for some people, especially people who might be like prone to a bit more imposter syndrome, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody else seems so confident, but you're like, I don't know what I'm doing, right? Um, and so I think just knowing that fact really helps people go, I'm going to feel a little bit disoriented and lost as I learn how to do this.
Mhm.
Um, and I learn sort of the norms and the skills within the discipline. Right? And I think just reminding yourself of that helps empower you as you go. Right? Um, and I think that sort of also relates to like how to think about like how you do on papers because it requires a bit more of a growth mindset, right? With the sort of algebra pyramid I talked about, right? You can go, I got 100 on the first thing, perfect. I got 100 on the next level, perfect. But in philosophy, it tends to be we throw you in to the philosophy pool, and you try something that looks like swimming, but it doesn't quite work. And we have to gently correct you and go, oh, good attempt, but you're not supposed to be, I don't know, flailing your arms about or something like that. And know that that's just part of the process, right? Is that it's the way it works is you try, fail, and then course correct. Try, fail, and course correct, right? Rather than having sure footing on every step along the way.
Right, right. So definitely the growth mindset is needed there. And the
Totally.
you know, the philosophy really lies in the process as well. The process of kind of like improving from paper to paper, the process of slowly building up your way of thinking about these big problems and being able to tackle them.
Hmm.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rees, for giving us this wonderful chat today, for bringing us on this giant philosophical rant. I'm sure we all have a lot of food for thought.
Of course, it was a pleasure, Andre. And this is such a cool project to have the podcast. So I can't wait to check out the other episodes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Reese. All right,
All right.
then that's it for today's episode, and see you all on the next one.
Bye.